the value of the pound has just collapsed. People then feel that in living standards failing to rise, and they also feel it in, for example, house prices. We need to massively ramp up production in this country. That means cutting taxes. We can only cut taxes by cutting spending.
That's the way they see it, and they would say, this is all the fault of Brexit. If only we hadn't done that.
All around the world, nationalism is on the rise, and there is now a major standoff between cosmopolitan globalists on the one hand and communitarian nationalists on the other. And that is happening in countries far, far removed from Brexit.
Steve Baker, welcome to The Capitalist.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Really appreciate it, Mark. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Now, you're no longer an MP or a minister. The battle of Brexit is far behind you. The battle's over COVID as well. You could be doing something relaxing like skydiving. Yet here you are launching a new political campaign. What's brought you back to the fray?
Well, I'm absolutely determined that we've got to, in a sense, rescue the direction of travel of this country. So I'm very clear that what's breaking down is a kind of managerialism which has been in place since the end of the Second World War. A set of assumptions about the merits of the government intervening in all our lives. And that's what's breaking down. And I still care very much about the future of this country. But I'll tell you, if I may, a little story. So I lost my seat. An American friend of mine rang me up. He said, Steve, you should have a think tank. You should have the Steve Baker Institute. And I said, I'm not Tony Blair. I can't have the, it's not going to work. But he said, no, you should have a free market think tank. I said, let me think about it. And I realised that London's got plenty of great free market think tanks. And what's required is for more to be heard from them, more notice to be taken of them. And I reflected that my time in Parliament was very often about making sure that there was impact for ideas. And so I intend to use many of the things I learned during my time in Parliament to serve the free market think tanks and all of the voices for freedom. So that's what we're going to do. And the reason why we need to do it is because managerialism is failing and we're having the wrong conversation about it.
You've been very vocal about the scale of the crisis that we're facing. And it's kind of a slow motion crisis, but one that is increasingly urgent. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes, sure. So you don't have to just take my word for it. I mean, the Office for Budget Responsibility every 2 years does a fiscal sustainability report. And they have a chart in there which shows spending soaring away in the coming decades, but revenues stagnating and decreasing a little bit. And that gap is, of course, debt and currency debasement. That's what's happened for 50 years. Since the end of Bretton Woods, the value of the pound has just collapsed. People then feel that in living standards failing to rise, and they also feel it in, for example, house prices. So what a hopeless situation we've ended up with for young people if they want to buy a house. We've got people complaining about a lack of family formation. Well, is it any wonder when it's practically impossible as a young person to buy a family home? But how are house prices determined? Well, state land use planning, which is, of course, socialism, but for too long we've ignored it and just adopted it as conservatives. And on the other hand, huge supply of cheap credit, which is, of course, directed by the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. And it's, again, a planning committee. And I'm afraid I feel a little bit like the little boy saying the emperor's got no clothes. But the truth is the emperor does have no clothes. And I spent 14 years as an MP saying to Conservative colleagues in private, you do know we're operating a state land use planning system, and that is socialism, and it's going to fail. And I was sort of patted on the head or ignored, and I'm afraid it's still failing, and it's going to continue to fail. So we need to start being really bold and optimistic and hopeful in agitating for a free society. We can't any longer just absorb and make our own the assumptions of the past, because they're failing, they're breaking down.
And as we talk today, there's a lot of excitement in the bond markets. The sort of 30-year gilt yields are up at a level that we haven't seen in decades. It's an increasing sign that the bond market is concerned about the fiscal health of the UK, a feeling that, government spending is out of control, government debt is out of control, and the current government doesn't seem to have a way to bring it down through spending reform, welfare reform, and so on. Do you think that that's a real problem for us?
It's a huge problem. I'm afraid, though, when I lost my seat, I did say it on air famously, it's going to be a circus because they need to do austerity and they have to do it with these MPs who have told their electors that austerity is a choice. I think that's broadly what I said. Look at the huge rebellion Keir Starmer just suffered. He needed to adjust the way that personal independence payment works. Because the Labour whips have borne down so hard on Labour MPs, they couldn't put on a small rebellion. They had to put on a giant rebellion so they didn't all lose the whip. So they put on a huge rebellion. Well, now they've got a taste for it. Well, what does that tell the bond markets? It says that this Labour government is not very likely to cut spending. Well, everyone can read the OBR's reports and all the rest of it. And although bond markets trade in long-dated instruments, they take day-by-day decisions. So if the Chancellor's down and being, practically replaced by a new incoming economic advisor, plus the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is now the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, she's looking fairly powerless. That creates a great deal of uncertainty. But they can be certain that Labour MPs won't vote to cut spending. Well, it's no wonder that the bond markets are complaining. And I'm afraid this Labour government is accelerating what was happening already. And it is really worrying. If I may just pick up on something else. The Government Actuaries Department already sounds very boring, doesn't it? They audit the National Insurance Fund. The National Insurance Fund is not a sovereign wealth fund. It's like a current account through which an enormous amount of money washes from taxes and out to benefits, pensions, so on. That fund does need to stay above zero. It will hit zero in 2043-4, according to the government actuaries. So that gives us about 20 years before we're hard into default. I take that as a proxy to say that's basically how long we've got. Now, one might say, well, we'll just raise taxes and top it up. Except taxes are already at excruciating levels. The economist David B. Smith wrote a paper first for the Treasury Committee and then for Politeia, asking are UK taxes at their limit? And the answer very firmly is yes. And this is what politicians have to confront. The mere politics of trying to say whatever the public want to hear isn't going to get us through the next 20 years. The next 20 years, we're going to need our own Malay.
Our own Malay. Well, that's an answer that we've heard as well from Kemi Badenoch. She's mentioned this. What do you think that has been so successful with Milei? Because, of course, he came into power in Argentina and there were economists, at least on the left, lining up to say, well, this is a very dangerous free market experiment. This is a terrible idea. It's not going to work. But he does seem to have achieved remarkable things in quite a short space of time. Yeah,
he really does. And what's more is he's popular as he does it. Mm-hmm. Well, he is an Austrian school classical liberal to libertarian. And there's not very many of us around. Now, the shortest route is for Kemi actually to be our Milei, to me. She says she wants to be. I wish her well, and I hope she is. But to me, Austrian school economics, which fundamentally embraces the way that human beings are, accepts that people act with purpose to improve their circumstances. And once you begin with that, you start to understand that the knowledge you need to plan society isn't available. It's because it's tacit. We don't know it ourselves. It's dispersed in the minds of billions of individuals. It's subjective. It's time variant. I couldn't tell you whether I'd have tea or coffee first thing in the morning very often. And so all of these facts about knowledge make it impossible to make the socialist system work. So you need prices to help convey that knowledge, that information about what people actually want in order to make a cooperation in a market work. So he's an Austrian school classical liberal who accepts the importance of time, the importance of production time, and the facts about dispersed knowledge. And that means he's at odds with most economists. Most economists think that you can draw equations which allow you to run one coarse aggregate off against another, say inflation and unemployment. And the thing is, coarse aggregates don't work against each other. Again, the emperor's got no clothes. Since Keynes, economists have believed a great many clever things which turn out not to be true. So, for example, production time's another good one. If you buy a car today, when was the ore dug out of the ground. Well, it wasn't this morning, was it? Or it wasn't last week. It was probably years ago. So production time really matters in economic processes, and it's not legitimate to collapse away the time and pretend it's all happening today in order to make your maths work. And yet that's what's done. That's what economists do. And it's driving me potty. So all this flows out of why is Millet successful when economists are telling him that he will fail? Well, that really is a great question for economists. Economists should be asking themselves, as they did when they failed to foresee the global financial crisis coming, why are we so wrong? And I can tell them it's because they're trapped in the wrong economic paradigm. Fundamental mistakes about method, knowledge, and the importance of time. And until the economists and the economics profession really breaks out of groupthink, it's not that they're bad people. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. It's not that they're not clever. They're terrifically clever. They're terrifically well educated. But just like Thomas Kuhn taught us in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, once mistakes creep into the bottom of an enormous pyramid of knowledge, until you correct those mistakes at the bottom of the pyramid, the whole body of knowledge is in the wrong place and needs rebasing. So Millet stands a good chance, and I would never have seen it coming, he stands a good chance by his own example of rebasing the economics profession, and I hope he does.
What would that mean for the UK? I mean, if we were to have a Millet in the UK, let's say there's some miracle in the polls and Kemi Badenoch comes in, or perhaps even Reform UK comes in and Nigel Farage turns himself into more of a Millet-type character, goes back to his more free marketeer roots.
Yeah.
What do they start by doing?
They have got to cut spending. Now, it's not that we don't know what to do here. Lord John Moynihan, just wrote a brilliant book called The Return to Growth. And he's been through and set out everything that needs to be done. But at the moment, it's well outside the paradigm, the consensus of what's possible, the Overton window. Things like we do need to abandon net zero. That doesn't mean we need to roll everything back, but we do need to abandon massive subsidies going into renewable energy. We need to abandon the idea that we can leave the oil and gas in the ground. Again, Kemi's very good on that. But we are going to need to deal with pensions. Both the state pension and the public sector pension are unaffordable. If you look, as John does, at the scale of those liabilities next to the national debt, they're not a fraction of the national debt. They're a multiplier on top of the national debt. Now, the figures are very dependent on the discount ratio, but we're talking of 4 or 5 times the national debt is what we owe in public sector and state pensions. It just won't be paid. It just won't be. We need to massively ramp up production in this country. That means cutting taxes. We can only cut taxes by cutting spending. So extremely difficult decisions will have to be taken. And a UK Millet will have to do the sorts of things Millet's been doing. Decide that they're really for the free market, that entire functions of the state are going to be cut, and that we're going to go, I'm afraid, radically for the free market.
But do you think that either our politicians or the public are really ready for that? In a sense, a lot of these problems are very abstract, they're very serious, but they're very slow moving. So it's easy in a way to sit back as the public and say, well, we would much rather have a nice, easy answer to this. There's got to be some magic thing. We don't have to worry about this for 20 years. And for the politicians too, because they tell the public what they want to hear. Are we going to be ready, even by the next election, for this sort of radical medicine, or do things have to get much worse first? We need to be not quite in the condition of Argentina, perhaps, but further down that road towards like calling the IMF or some sort of real bond market crisis, which we don't have at the moment.
It may well be that pain is the only medicine that teaches us to change, but I would like to avoid that. I would far prefer that we all came to our senses, and that's what the Fighting for a Free Future project is about, which I'm launching, because it's about serving the think tanks that we have. It's about serving the voices for freedom which exist in our country, bringing them together and allowing them to amplify one another. So we'll do the podcast, which is The Insurgency. We'll do the Substack, which is Voices Fighting for a Free Future. We'll have educational programs, and we'll have a community which enables people to collaborate. So people will do whatever they want to do. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. There's no question of controlling them. It wouldn't be possible if we tried. We're not going to do that. But what we are going to do is put together the infrastructure around them, which allows them to have a better chance of steering the public debate. And this is why journalists and other opinion formers are so important, because until we start asking better questions, can we afford this spending? And asking Labour MPs, well, what will happen if you keep voting against spending cuts. I know you don't like them, but what will happen? And if the government actuaries are right and others that we've only got perhaps 4 parliaments to sort this problem out, what will that mean for pensioners in your constituency that you didn't act today? So that's what the Fighting for a Free Future project really is about. It's about saying it would be better if we shifted the terrain of debate now, so that when we arrive at the next general election, there is a chance of the public being offered a politician they can vote for who will do the right things. And I've just realised we can't leave this to party politics anymore. So this is not a partisan project. But, Kemi wants to tell everybody the truth. Nigel's gone from being a Thatcherite to being somebody who's much more communitarian nationalist, which is part of a great realignment of politics that's in progress. But, I sort of throw my hands up. Who amongst those people presently in Parliament is going to remotely deliver what needs to be done? And somebody's got to. So I hope that together with CAPEX and lots of other participants for freedom, we can start really amplifying one another's voices with courage and with boldness and with truth and integrity, and shift the debate so that it actually serves the public.
Well, you were talking there about the great realignment which has been happening in politics, which is visible to see on every side for anyone who's paying attention. But of course, in that realignment, which used to be the economics debate was very much focused on economics and free markets and that kind of thing from the 80s and so forth. And now it's more about identity, belonging, nationalism. And with that comes a greater interest in state power on the right and the left. And of course, we had Labour coming into power saying that they were going to use the state to get at growth. And then you've got Nigel Farage, as you say, wanting to use the state to help the poor and the left behind. And Conservatives in recent years in power have done a little bit of that themselves. In all of that, how do you get people interested still in freedom? Do you have to find some way of making that message work within this new realignment so that you're not just telling the out-of-date story?
Well, absolutely. Yes, all of that. We can't be telling out-of-date stories. We need to be talking about the future and hopefulness. So I would like young people to have the hope of a family home and a greater income and so forth. So we need to explain how freedom delivers those things. But you absolutely hit on a crucial issue. Until commentators, journalists, politicians themselves understand that the main axis of politics no longer lies where it used to, they are not going to remotely understand what is going on in the world. And it's not the UK and it's not Brexit. It wasn't Brexit that brought Trump to power. It wasn't Brexit that caused Alternative for Deutschland to sweep East Germany. And on it goes. Meloni in Italy and Front National in France. These are not phenomena caused by the Brexit vote. It's possible that a reorientation of politics towards the nation contributed to the Brexit vote, but people get the cart before the horse. And it is incredibly inconvenient that at just the moment, this next generation, when we have to confront the fiscal challenge of government, that the managerial state is breaking down and failing. And therefore, the philosophy of freedom and the return to it is the most important thing to me that we need to do. At just that moment, the main axis of politics has become something else. It's very dangerous, because if a nationalist voting population believes that state power is the answer to our troubles, and what they need to do is blame the other, because that's what's happened in the past, I'm afraid. People get into terrible economic trouble and then blame the other and coalesce around groups, which people I've learned through my work, Professor Paul Dolan, we're all hardwired to have in-groups and out-groups and blame and so forth. It's a very dangerous phenomenon, and people don't need me to elaborate it. So I think there's a real imperative right now to change the terms of debate, and freed from the need to get re-elected and show any kind of party discipline, I can participate in that. So I have business interests as well, but I'm going to give a substantial portion of my time to helping to amplify the great voices, as you do as well on CAPEX, to amplifying great voices for freedom and try and get the people who influence the public debate to think again and start asking different questions.
You were mentioning there the Brexit vote, and of course we were talking about people who are stuck in old paradigms, old stories, the managerial class. There are plenty of people there who can't escape that particular narrative, and they look at what has happened since Brexit, or that's the way they see it, and they would say, this is all the fault of Brexit. If only we hadn't done that. That's really, now we're in this terrible economic, political muddle, and so they lay the blame at the Brexiteers. And what would be your response to that?
Some people will always do that, and some of them will never change their minds. Again, I do work with Paul, behavioural scientist, and he's taught me so much about psychology and the way that we are. In particular, the tendency of actually particularly well-educated people to believe that they're right in the face of contrary evidence. We're extremely good as human beings at rejecting contrary evidence. And the cleverer we are, the better educated we are, it turns out the greater propensity we seem to have to reject evidence that doesn't fit with what we believe. So some people just will never change their minds. And I regret that, but my work with Paul separately is about what we could do about that to embed tolerance by design, and also crucially to enable people to collaborate as adversaries. So there's a lot in his behavioural science and my experience which can support people with that. But the thing we need to do really is reach for reason. And that's tricky when people are wound up and emotional, and particularly if they're reacting to me, watching this podcast, listening to this podcast, or Steve Baker, Brexiteer. But to be reasonable, all around the world, nationalism is on the rise. And there is now a major standoff between cosmopolitan globalists on the one hand and communitarian nationalists on the other. And that is happening in countries far, far removed from Brexit. And I think if people want to solve the problems we face instead of just blaming, then they should look at the actual evidence before them. Donald Trump didn't come to power because of Brexit, and he is the single most important figure in the Western world's politics right now. And look what he's doing to trade policy. It's, for me as a free trader, it's very frightening to see, because I'm absolutely clear that unhampered trade and competition on the merits are the most powerful forces in human history for the amelioration of suffering and for raising people into prosperity and happiness. And he threatens it. Why? Because for decade after decade, nations have superficially opened up to trade by lowering tariffs, but they've had behind-the-border anti-competitive market distortions. Shankar Singham's very good on all this. And that's what he's fighting. I mean, he's doing it in a brutal way. It's difficult always to penetrate. But the American system is now saying, oh, actually, no, you're not going to do this to us anymore. You're going to remove your behind-the-border barriers, regulatory barriers to our goods and services. And so even with Trump, good may come out of it. But the crucial point is that Trump can't possibly have arisen because of Brexit.
Many people who were in favour of Brexit, I suppose you included, very much saw it as an opportunity to make Britain more focused on free trade around the world, on a lower tax economy, lower regulation, getting out of the grip of EU red tape. Do you feel that Brexit has been a wasted opportunity, at least so far?
We have certainly wasted many of the opportunities, yes. So particularly regulatory opportunities. We should have been very considerably breaking away from EU laws, particularly the laws we complained about as Conservatives over the years, in order to deal with anti-competitive market distortions and free up our economy and go for growth as a matter of urgency. So the proximate reason why I went into Parliament and was a Brexiteer was because we didn't get a vote on the Constitution for Europe. It got rammed through as the Lisbon Treaty, positively against expressed wishes of electorates. I'm still amazed that more people don't share my view that that was an outrage, but apparently they don't. But that's why I became a Brexiteer. I used to be a European federalist beforehand. I've said that many times, people still don't believe me, but I used to drive my wife mad with my, like most Remain voters, automatic, easygoing, pro-EU attitude until I started really looking at what it was. But on the economic side, yes, we have wasted the opportunity for deregulation, and that's much to be regretted.
Do you think COVID too, and the reaction to COVID, is part of the problem politically, in the sense that it's helped create a sense of anger and suspicion in the population, a period when quite a lot of people were ignoring the law or were feeling that the law was completely absurd, people now increasingly questioning the lockdowns and feeling sort of hostile towards the people who did that. Do you think that's sort of added to the political situation we're in?
Absolutely it has. And you may remember that I was the deputy chair of the COVID recovery group working with Mark Harper, raising questions about the trade-offs involved. But COVID brought to an absolute focus and pinnacle all of the problems which we suffer. Absolute state power. No one needs me to elaborate what was done. We all lived through it. In not only enormous borrowing, but QE, which covered that borrowing. Again, the Office for Budget Responsibility published the charts. They're on my Twitter feed. I've published papers about them. But there are the bars going up of the gilts being issued to borrow money, and little yellow diamonds on the chart, which more or less, give or take, match those bars. We basically printed all the money we needed to borrow. And it was done indirectly using the mechanisms which avoid a hyperinflation, which they do. But this is the territory we're on now. Jan Vleger, a Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee economist, made a speech in which he particularly emphasised that the difference between what we were doing and Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic was that the Monetary Policy Committee is independent. And that's why we're not getting hyperinflation. I abridge, but I particularly pressed the governor before I came off the Treasury Committee, I pressed the governor on this point, and he agreed with me that that was what Jan was saying, that it's the MPC that's preventing a hyperinflation. But we did have a big inflation afterwards. And it's a peculiar kind of madness that people can't see that we haven't been living life in a free society. We've been living life in a highly interventionist managerial society with vast amounts of cheap credit and QE, enormous amounts of debt, terrifically interventionist regulation across a wide field, and very, very high taxes. This is not conservative or classical liberal economic policy, and it's failing, and we should expect it to fail.
I think the problem, though, is when you look at that and you start to accept that situation, then you have to say, well, the only way forward is an awful lot of pain, because as you were talking about earlier, we're going to slash spending, or we're going to have to do some very difficult decisions that no one really wants to make. And do you need a vision, again, for people, and this is quite hard to convey to them, I suppose, of what that free society would be like if they're not really used to it anymore, that actually being in a society with much lower regulations, much lower taxes, but higher growth and more dynamism is actually an exciting place to be, and it would be worth the pain to get there and avoid some of the problems that are coming down the line. How do you get that across to people?
Well, first of all, I'd say I'd love to avoid pain.
Yeah.
I'd love to avoid pain. Nobody wants pain. Of course we don't. The problem with the situation that we're now in, there is going to be pain. There are going to be cuts. Either this government begins making them in the least painful way possible, and we start getting lower taxes and deregulation and coming out of it, or it will all be forced on us later. People are now starting to talk about whether we'll need an IMF bailout in the UK. If the IMF comes out, the conditions of IMF bailouts are draconian, and it will be extremely painful. But here's the irony of our position and why I've abandoned party politics. I mean, I'm still a member of the Conservative Party, but why I've given up hope in party politics. One of the most moderate and necessary things the government could do was to means test the winter fuel payment, to take it away from pensioners who didn't need it. I'm old enough to remember it coming in, and better off pensioners telling me that they'd give it to charity or spend it on a good bottle of whiskey. So fast forward, partly because it happened during a leadership campaign, the Conservatives opposed it because that was the easy thing to do. Reform join in opposing it, and they won the argument, and they expect people like me to be grateful that they won that argument. It's not a success. It's a disaster that the centre-right successfully prevented the centre-left from cutting unnecessary benefits to better off people. It's a fiscal and ideological disaster because it puts us on a track for real serious fiscal failure later. So Kemi does want to be honest with everybody, and unfortunately she picked that policy up after she became leader, so she doesn't share in the blame for it. But that is just a beginning of what we need to do. But I want to be really clear about this, and again, thank goodness I won't be standing for election unless something really strange happens. We are going to have to cut pensions, we're going to have to cut healthcare, we're going to have to cut social care, because these are the big areas of age-related spending which we cannot afford with an ageing population. We're going to have to work longer, still longer. I don't relish that. I'm 54. I don't want to work till I'm 67. We're going to have to work longer. The alternative to that is to default on our obligations, and that means letting down people with no other means of support. And that's what we need to communicate to people. And I'm not pretending I'm getting the messages right today.
I don't think it's a winning manifesto so far, Steve.
No, but the way to turn this around is to embrace the ideas which made this country as prosperous as it was relatively to the world, to embrace the ideas which made Hong Kong and Singapore as successful as they were. And after all, Hong Kong wasn't always wealthy. Hong Kong was in a disastrous state when Cowperthwaite took it on. Cowperthwaite's commitment to liberty turned Hong Kong into an enormously prosperous and successful society. So we do need to point to people and say liberty can be attractive. It's attractive because it works. What we can't do, though, we can't just sweep aside the welfare state, because those people who are now dependent on the welfare state for their existence because they're pensioners need to continue to have that support. The trick is going to be, in the 20 or so years ahead, adjusting, cutting those benefits, but leaving in place sufficient for those people who need it, that they are actually well provided for. And that's going to be one of the tests of our civility, actually.
Yeah. I mean, to take one very specific example, which is, of course, a Conservative policy, the triple lock on pensions.
Yes.
No one seems able to touch that. That seems like a complete disaster.
Well, while I was still an MP, I was on the record, I think it was the Telegraph who published me saying it's going to have to go. So I did try, amazed it didn't get more coverage, but I did say it had to go. What I believe happened there is that when we came to power in 2010, we were certainly set a number of landmines, political landmines by Gordon Brown, like the 50p top rate of tax.
Yeah.
And what we should have done, day one, I can see it now, I was a new MP then, we should have come in and immediately repealed all those measures that we'd been left as political landmines. We should have just called them out as political landmines and just done it first week we were in. Had taken that knock, but just kept repeating, these were political landmines. Gordon Brown could have done the 50p rate at the beginning in 97, and he didn't. And he didn't do it because it's not a good policy. He did it to catch us out. We're not letting him win. Instead, what I'm afraid George Osborne did was put in place a landmine for them. I am as sure as I can be that George Osborne and David Cameron didn't expect to win the 2015 election. They expected Labour to win or to be in coalition. And I believe that they put in place the obviously unsustainable triple lock in order to catch out the subsequent Labour government. And then, of course, we caught ourselves out with it. It's a disaster.
It was interesting to see Labour come in. And, of course, they had an enormous mandate, enormous majority. And yet they didn't really do bold and radical things with it. That's part of the problem, though, isn't it? There's governments come in, and even when they have the short window of time when they could do these things, they don't. I mean, as you were talking about the winter fuel allowance, that was a small and symbolic thing. They could have gone for the triple lock, something that would actually bring in some real money. And, given how much political pain they suffered for the winter fuel allowance, it would have been better to be hung for a sheep than a lamb. But
this is a really important point. Inauthenticity is not a solid basis for successful politics. I said again, before the general election, that Labour were positioning to the right of the Conservatives on issue after issue. They were positioning fiscally to the right of the Conservatives, positioning to the right of us on justice, immigration. They kept positioning to the right. After the election, they kept positioning to the right. Why? Because they knew they have had a very broad but very shallow victory. And what they were trying to do was to turn that shallow victory into a deep one, whereby they naturally became the party of government. So they kept positioning to the right. But then, of course, because they've got the MPs they have, who aren't bought into it and aren't just sheep automatically doing what they're told, they can't carry it through. And that's why I say inauthenticity is not a good basis for public policy. And you get caught out. And Labour very definitively positioned to the right and now have failed. So what really are they going to do? They're going to revert to type. I mean, they believe in this mad idea called the entrepreneurial state. Matsukato's around them. And the state is not an entrepreneur. It doesn't have the same incentives and rewards, and doesn't have the same right of initiative and so forth. It operates by rule following, not through prices, profit and loss. The idea of the entrepreneurial state is a disaster, but they'll try it on. That's where they thought the growth would come from. Rachel Reeves has said she wants to deregulate the city to get the credit flowing. But have they learned nothing? I once walked to an event with a then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and there were two of us behind him and one of my colleagues next to him. And I overheard him say to my colleague, of course, the way the UK economy works is house building, inexpensive credit and immigration. And I thought, well, at least I've heard it said out now, loud now, that we get growth. The way we get growth is house building, cheap credit and migration. Well, it's not working, is it? But when you look at what this Labour government's actually set out to do, they've set out to get growth by having house building. And now Rachel Reeves has said she wants to deregulate the city for more cheap credit. has anything changed? Have they learnt nothing? Well, one big thing that's changed, they can't possibly go for increased migration because the public won't wear it. We can't go on anymore trying to get growth through that formula. Yes, we need more housing, but it's not a successful basis for growth. So there is hope, but the hope will come from living in the real world, going for freedom, cutting spending, cutting taxes, and we can never deliver utopia, but we can get back to growth and give people the hope that their life will become better.
Just to draw on what you were saying about authenticity, is this then some small glimmer of hope for the Conservatives, in the sense that people are most angry with them for not being very conservative, and it seems like they are the only party there that could say authentically, we actually believe in a small state and in encouraging growth and business and entrepreneurship. They haven't been doing it of late, but that is in their DNA in a way that it's not for Labour and arguably not for Reform UK. It's hard to see it where they are in the polls right now, but it seems like if they could get it right, they are a party that could say authentically, we believe in the things that actually Britain needs to see done.
Well, that is why I've stuck with the Conservative Party as a member, yes, because I believe that I think it's the worst. The least worst. I think the Conservative Party is the least worst political party, probably in the world. I think it's the best hope we have, though it's a faint hope indeed. But if I may, the thing is that it must be understood with politics that it's always a contest between all of the individuals involved. I wish it was otherwise, but the idea that any political party leader has unchallengeable authority is for the birds. So Robert Jenrick is one of the biggest voices. He's chosen to focus on immigration, partly because of his brief, and that's fair enough, and he's an extremely effective campaigner. But Andrew Griffith, for example, really is making the case for free markets and business, which is his brief, and I think he's doing a brilliant job. He's not getting quite the coverage because of the mere politics of who's going to be the next leader. Well, somehow we need to change the debate so that somebody like Andrew Griffith, who really is making the case for limited government and freer markets, is actually heard to a greater extent.
This has been a fascinating conversation. We're going to have to draw it to an end. Just before we do, though, I know you say you're not going back into politics.
Yeah.
But if you were in the number 10 with actual power to change, what's the thing you do on day one just to try and sort out Britain's unsustainable course?
The awful truth about what you do on day one, and by the way, I did draft a day one plan for Boris Johnson, which I understand he used. You change the way you relate to your members of parliament, because nothing is going to get done for this country until a prime minister can have a programme, which is difficult, which can get through the House of Commons. Because too many leaders, time and again, have forgotten the basics of leadership, that you must carry people with you. So the day one most important thing to do is to change the structures by which the leader and ministers engage with backbench members of parliament so that they can be carried through very difficult days. Because this is a democracy. Power flows to the Prime Minister through the House of Commons. And Keir Starmer's just shown us what happens if you treat them with contempt and try and suppress them. It all blows up in your face. But, any Prime Minister be well advised to make sure they stay in touch with their members of parliament. Beyond that, we've got to go across the entire field. I would say a good place to start is John Moynihan's book, The Return to Growth. That should be the manifesto. It should be slimmed down and Conservative logos slapped on it, and it should be used as our manifesto.
Well, there's some good articles by John on CapEx that people can read if they want something a little shorter than the book, but I agree the book's an excellent start. Steve Baker's been a fantastic conversation.
Mark, thank you very much.